There is something so eerie about a case like the one I'm about to tell you about today. I think it's because sleeping in your bed in the comfort of your home is where you're supposed to feel the most safe. Ironically, it's often the place small children feel most afraid and vulnerable. They wander into our grown-up bedrooms and tell us they're afraid of the monster under the bed or the shadow near their closet. We reassure them that there are no monsters, that they're safe, and we tuck them back in again, retreating to our rooms knowing they are safe and sound in our presence. But every once in a while, there is a case like this, one that changes our perception of safety and shatters that illusion. In the early morning hours of the 4th of July in 2002, 4-year-old Dannarriah was put to bed. Inside her small Orange, Texas home was her mother, siblings, and cousins. It should have been a routine night, but when her mother awoke, she was gone. Days later, her body would be found in the nearby community of Pleasure Island, and it was clear that her last moments were horrific. Dannarriah's case has DNA evidence, and technology has advanced in the last few years, which could open up more opportunities for testing. There is so much hope for closure, and accountability in this case should be just around the corner. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Dannarriah Finley. Just as a content warning, this episode contains discussion of sexual abuse of a child. Please take care when listening. In the far east point of Texas, nestled along the Sabine River near the Louisiana border, is the city of Orange, Texas. The population is around 19,000, and it's known for being a tight-knit and mostly safe community. Now, the weather there is not for everyone. The summers are hot, and the area is known to flood and be at risk for major hurricanes. But those who have lived there for their entire lives are pretty used to it, or as used to it as you can be. One young resident of Orange was 4-year-old Dannarriah Finley. In the summer of 2002, she was approaching her 5th birthday and would be heading off to kindergarten in the fall. She lived with her mother, Jamie Arnold, along with 3 other sisters who were 2, 6, and 8 years old at the time. Her parents were not together, but her father, Johnny Edwards, often picked her up for visits, and when she was with him, she'd have playdates with her half-brother. Dannarriah went to a local pre-K program at the North Early Learning Center, and there are photos of her attending there with her sweet smile and playful innocence. The shy girl with the cute braids, she really was just cute as a button. On the evening of July 3rd into the early morning of July 4th, 2002, Dannarriah was home with her siblings and 3 cousins, who her mom was babysitting. The house was located at 1016 4th Street in Orange, Texas. These cousins were planning on spending the night, but her mom wasn't home for most of the evening. Her 26-year-old mother, Jamie, was working her job at a local fast food restaurant. One thing you'll find out about this case is that you're going to have a lot of questions that come up where the answers just haven't been released to the public. So you're probably already wondering, was there any adult there providing supervision until Jamie got home? What ages were the cousins? Where did they all sleep for these sleepovers? And honestly, we just don't know all of that, which feels significant, but again, it just hasn't been released publicly. Here's what we do know. According to Dannarriah's mother, Jamie, she arrived home from work and put the children to bed around 1:30 a.m. on July 4th, 2002. She said she checked on the kids, including Dannarriah, at around 4 a.m. When Jamie got up around 10 a.m., she couldn't locate Dannarriah. Jamie at first tried to call relatives, and she spent about 3 hours doing so. And I'm talking relatives, friends, anyone who may have just taken Dannarriah and let her keep sleeping, and just maybe didn't leave a note. When Jamie found that nobody had Dannarriah, she called police. Orange Police Chief Sam Kittrell would later say in an interview that typically in missing persons cases, even when it's children, it ends up being a situation where they try not to think the worst because they may have just wandered away, there's been a miscommunication of caregivers, you name it. But he said in this case, something just felt dark and off from the get-go, that it was just different, and so they took it really seriously. And the community felt the same way. They sprang into action. Local reporting highlighted how her tragic disappearance brought people together. It didn't matter if you were poor or wealthy, man or woman, what religious beliefs you held, what color your skin was. Everyone was out looking for Dannarriah together, arm in arm, just pulling together to try to find this girl. In the hours after her disappearance, police brought in scent tracking dogs, but they didn't have much luck. Also, as part of a routine investigation, they questioned people who were in the home and those local to the neighborhood. They went door to door to door and got statements from everybody. While we don't know the sleeping arrangement and how that was all set up, we know that in asking those who were in the house that night that nobody said they heard or saw anything. There were no signs of a struggle and no signs of forced entry. But there's good reason for that. You see, Jamie Arnold admitted that she often kept the door unlocked, including that night, because sometimes her mother would stop over. Please know I am not shaming Jamie with what I'm about to say next. I can only imagine how much regret Jamie lives with, and millions of Americans leave their doors unlocked all the time and nothing happens. But in reading interviews with people who are offenders who are locked up, and I'm talking a range of crimes, things from burglary all the way through sex offenders and sexual predators, they've provided insight into their own behavior behind bars. And it often comes up that they will case neighborhoods and sometimes just try doors and windows until they find unlocked ones. Investigators also had to consider that the schedule that this timeline was operating on was not a normal sleep-wake schedule for a preschooler. It's not typical to go to bed in the wee hours of the morning. And as a parent myself, one thing I can personally attest to is that when my kids were little like that, it didn't matter what time I put them to bed, they were going to get up at their same early time that their body was used to. Sometimes I would think, oh, I'll keep them up an hour later and they will let me sleep in an hour later. And no, they'd be up with the birds. I digress. I swear I'm going somewhere with this, and that is that Jamie slept in that morning until 10, but Dannarriah may have gotten up early and gone outside to play. And then it's possible she wasn't abducted from her home and from her bedroom while she was sleeping, but from her neighborhood yard. To this day, we just don't know. The chief of police of Orange, Texas at this time was Sam Kittrell, who I already mentioned earlier. He and his team thought of a lot of things, and they moved quickly on them, things that are sometimes red tape barriers in searches. One example I'll use is that they were searching abandoned houses, and believe it or not, you actually still need a warrant for something like that, and so they were finding these landlords who owned these abandoned houses, of course, and they were able to get that permission quickly to search them, which is huge. They secured the garbage can from the house to look for any clues in the trash, so they took that trash out before anybody came to collect that. They were looking for anything that might have been discarded. And they really went, not only did they go door to door, they were looking underneath houses. They were looking at any of these small little spaces that a 4-year-old could be hiding in. Say she got lost and she might just be scared. Dannarriah's father, Johnny, offered to put his 1980s Cadillac up as a reward for information. He had planned to pick Dannarriah up later in the day, on the day she went missing, for one of their visits together with his other son. And now, instead of seeing his daughter that day, he was part of a search party looking for her. Dannarriah Street was known to be a mostly quiet block, but now dozens of cars and people made their way down the street, looking at the house cordoned off with yellow police tape. Some people were playing amateur detective and trying to figure out what could have happened. And of course, there was the neighborhood gossip. Was it a stranger? Was it a neighbor? Was it someone the family knew? Had this person been watching the house and watching Dannarriah? Despite the chatter, this community was committed to working together and finding this little girl. On Saturday morning, July 6th, a volunteer group of searchers met at Mount Zion Church at 512 West John Street, which was just a block or so away from Dannarriah's home. Jamie Arnold had tears pouring down her cheeks, moved by the community's efforts and turnout to help search for her little girl. She clutched articles of her daughter's clothing underneath her arms and watched as about 200 people showed up, despite the July heat reaching over 90 degrees. In true Texas fashion, the search group huddled together in prayer before they went off. The Red Cross, along with local businesses and the local church ladies, of course, all turned up with food and water for the searchers. People actually had to take pretty regular breaks because they were getting dizzy and they were feeling that heat exhaustion. Nevertheless, they persevered. Despite his own personal uneasiness, Sam Kittrell motivated the crowd by saying kids sometimes just get out and they fall in manholes, and other kids have been out for a few days and then rescued safely. Jamie Arnold told the newspaper The Orange Leader, quote, "I'm hoping this search will bring my child home. I'm amazed at how so many people have been great and wonderful and concerned about me," end quote. A reward of $18,000 was put in place for Dannarriah's safe recovery. But the sun set that day without any clues to Dannarriah's whereabouts. The search resumed on Sunday and was a copy and paste of Saturday. More searches. The Aerial Law Enforcement Response Team, which was a Houston-based nonprofit organization that searched for missing people, they pulled together and checked exits and back roads near Interstate 10 on Sunday. They used an Army surplus helicopter. Tim Miller's famous Texas EquiSearch organization also joined in with 70 volunteers. They used horses, boats, four-wheelers, cars, and a helicopter. Monday, July 8th started out just like the other search days, with everybody joining in prayer and ready to do it all over. But by afternoon, the community's worst fears were confirmed when the body of a young girl was found 20 miles away.
Hello, my name is Chrissy Champagne. I am the host and creator of Residue, a true crime podcast dedicated to keeping you paranoid. I'm one of those 80s kids that grew up watching Oprah, Donahue, Sally Jessy Raphael, and what did I learn from those shows? Never go to the second location, always trust your gut, and always stay paranoid. On Residue, I will tell you stories like the 1906 tragic love story of Grace Brown that inspired the classic Hollywood film A Place in the Sun. And speaking of Hollywood, I also tell true tales of cursed film sets. And I'm going to add in some stories about mean girls that are so scary even Regina George would run. But one thing always ties all of these stories together, and that is the loved ones that are left behind. Residue. Something that remains after the main part has been gone or taken. Join me on Residue, where I will tell you horrific true tales that will teach you to always keep one eye open. Stay paranoid.
Located 20 miles southwest of Orange in Port Arthur, Texas, is the man-made island named Pleasure Island. Bordered by Sabine Lake, the area is known for recreation and tourism. On the morning of July 8th, pipeline workers were dredging off a side road near the Causeway Bridge, 225 yards away from a dock. As they were working, they stumbled into a horrifying discovery: the mostly nude body of a young girl. Some sources say that her body was wrapped in a sheet, and some say that there was a sheet found nearby. The FBI and local officials reported to the scene to investigate, but initially they would not provide any details to the press, not the age of the child, the race, anything identifiable. No matter who it was someone's child who had been murdered. There is no happy answer to this. But deep down, the community felt that the search for Dannarriah had come to an end. Word of the discovery hit searchers hard. Dozens of searchers had resumed Monday with heat indexes exceeding 100. And now with the word spreading, the worst-case scenario was coming to fruition. One man even drove by the neighborhood and said, "It's her, they found her, the pajamas matched." But testing had to be done to confirm her identity, so her family and community waited. On Tuesday, Orange Police Major Steve Jones said to the media, quote, "I'm not going to say for sure that it's her. I can't do that to the family. But there is certainly the high probability that this is her," end quote. He would not elaborate on the clothing found on or near the body, nor would he discuss how long it seemed the body had been there by the waterway. By Wednesday, though, the worst news was confirmed. The body found in Pleasure Island was that of Dannarriah Finley. An autopsy revealed that Dannarriah had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death, and then her body disposed of into the Texas swamps like a piece of trash. Later reporting would state that her body was wrapped in a sheet and that her pajamas were also found. This is another piece that has some contradiction. It sounds like in some articles that she was wearing at least maybe one article of her pajamas, and then another piece was found nearby, but others indicate that the pajamas were just found in proximity to her remains. Because Dannarriah's body was found in Port Arthur and she was abducted in Orange, there were multiple jurisdictions involved in this investigation. There were at least 2 crime scenes, that of the abduction and that where her body was found, and very likely a 3rd crime scene where the murder actually took place, something that has yet to be figured out to this day. In the days immediately following Dannarriah's murder, the community chatter ramped up. Dannarriah attended the North Early Learning Center, which was kind of the equivalent to a Head Start center that you might be familiar with. Deborah Mitchell was the Family Services Coordinator there at the time, and she told Juan Lozano of the Associated Press that Dannarriah had been taught at school not to go with strangers. She said, quote, "She was a very sweet girl, very much a joy to be around. Once she knew you, she would be very warm, but she was not the type of child who would go to someone she did not know," end quote. So I think about that for a minute. We know, or rather we don't know, how sound of a sleeper Dannarriah was. Was she the type of 4-year-old that could be scooped up out of bed and stay asleep? Maybe, and if that's the case, the stranger danger piece is kind of a moot point. But if she was the type that was awoken easily, what would it have taken for her to be taken out of the house without disturbing the several family members in the residence? We're talking a tiny bungalow. I'll have a picture of it on our Instagram at simplertimecrimepod. If she was one to stir and wake up, then you'd have to imagine that either she was so frightened she completely froze and didn't make any noise, or the person was somebody that she knew and trusted. Someone who whispered to her not to make a noise, and maybe they even said something like, "I'm taking you to babysit you at my house to help your mother." Obviously, that's just conjecture, but it's a possibility when you're thinking through the different scenarios. Another person who spoke to Juan Lozano was Marva Paul, the director of the Beat the Streets boys camp located in Dannarriah's neighborhood. Marva was a 43-year resident of the neighborhood back in 2002 and said that it wasn't always the safest. Marva said, quote, "I notice kids are unattended at times in the area. It has a lot of alcohol and drugs and prostitution," end quote. Which brings me to the next topic of conversation. I actually went back and forth about bringing this up. It's very important to me in discussing these cases that I do not further victimize a family that has already endured the unimaginable. I want to be sensitive in sharing these cases. And in the end, I'm going to discuss this next piece for a couple of important reasons. One, because it's brought up quite a bit in news articles and online discussion from the time, but it lacks depth and nuance to the situation. And second, because I do think it provides important context to the environment that may have made Dannarriah more vulnerable to a neighborhood predator who was watching. So not long before Dannarriah went missing, her mother Jamie had been investigated by the Texas Department of Child and Family Services for neglect. CPS officials went on record to say that she had been investigated previously for not properly supervising her children. Agency spokeswoman Adacia Knight told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, quote, "In this case, we did validate neglectful supervision. The caseworker identified weaknesses in the family, and she felt the family could use some services," end quote. So first, I want to emphasize that last sentence. The heart of CPS casework and how it's supposed to function ideally is to identify vulnerabilities in parenting and in child safety. And so much of CPS is not this willful abuse that you're picturing. It's a lack of social support network or systemic support. Take Jamie, for example. She was working a low-income job. She was in her mid-20s. She had 4 children. She was a single mom, and she was working in the fast food service industry. So she's working late hours where daycares aren't open, and she otherwise probably can't afford to put her kids in daycare even if they were. So some of what CPS would do in this instance is look at her and they would counsel her on, do you have unpaid supports in your network, like family who could help you care for your kids? Are there subsidized daycare options we can help you locate? Things like that. This CPS case was just opened a few months before Dannarriah's abduction. We know that she had Dannarriah's cousins there that night. It's possible that her and a relative, like a sister or a sister-in-law, were helping watch each other's kids, and maybe they just had this small gap in their overlap. We don't know the full story, and because they were likely wrapped in their grief and feeling judged, Dannarriah's parents and relatives didn't talk to the press much after she was found murdered. So the CPS came up in news articles a lot, but as I was saying, not much nuance to the discussion. So I wanted to offer some different perspective. After Dannarriah's murder, Jamie Arnold voluntarily had her children stay with relatives until the CPS case was resolved, and eventually it was. And even a couple years down the road, it was noted that the living situation was now considered stable. Ideally, these kids were better supervised, no doubt. It's one of those situations where 2 things can be true at the same time. Keep in mind, though, Jamie was presumably home when the abduction happened. She checked in on Dannarriah for the final time at 4 a.m., and she had been home since 1:30 a.m. and tucked Dannarriah into bed. So unless she left again after tucking Dannarriah in, which we don't know, I assume not, but can't be sure, and unless she wasn't being truthful about the 4 a.m. check-in, we can assume she was home. So then the whole reason that the lack of supervision comes into play is that for the predators in the neighborhood, for the sex offenders in that neighborhood, they regularly would have easier access to those children if they didn't have the adult supervision. They could be watching routines. If the kids were playing outside, it would be easier to have a conversation with them when there aren't parents watching them. It's that grooming, all of that. And you may have noticed that I didn't say if there were sex offenders in the neighborhood, because the reality is they're everywhere. Whether or not they have been caught or not, or acted on it or not, they're there. So that's, again, not to shame, but it's important to discuss the reality because that could be a key factor in this case. On Friday, July 19th, 2002, Dannarriah Finley was remembered at Mount Zion Church. Over 300 people came to the funeral. The women of the family dressed in white, and the men wore dark suits with pink ribbons pinned to them. Dannarriah was laid to rest in a tiny white casket with pink flowers on top and school pictures all surrounding the casket. A youth choir sang, "God loves the little children," as people wept throughout the service. Church clerk Georgia Cotton read, quote, "Heaven will be sweeter and more beautiful, more to be desired, because of the entrance through its shining gates of little Dannarriah." I want to pivot back to the initial and subsequent days after Dannarriah's body was identified and what that investigation looked like. Investigators did go back and re-interview those closest to her. They did multiple large-scale searches of Dannarriah's home, confiscating items for testing, even things like her stuffed teddy bear. It's worth noting that Jamie was not present for one of them, but when she returned home, she did tell onlookers that police had given her a heads up that they were coming. And to me, that makes sense. That's where the initial crime of abduction took place from, right on that property. Investigators spoke to and verified the whereabouts of all sex offenders in Jefferson and Orange counties. I imagine it was a lot of interviewing. It's unclear how much they actually vetted those alibis, but they did say that they spoke to all known registered sex offenders in the area. The FBI also brought in criminal profilers to try to get a sense of who this killer might be and what characteristics they might hold. According to an article by Margaret Toll in the Orange Leader, the FBI used statistical analysis in this case. The agents study cases from all over the world and work on statistics and probability. Detectives hoped that not only would the FBI be able to help give them more information on the killer, they hoped they might also be able to study the crime scene and determine the chain of events as well as the motive. The FBI did not release too much of the profile to the public, but what they did say dropped a bombshell. In a press release in late July of 2002, it was revealed that Dannarriah's killer had made a mistake and that they had evidence to confirm the identity of someone, which screams DNA evidence to me. They also shared that this crime scene was sloppy. In the press release, they said, quote, "From an analysis of this scene, it is indicative that this was not a sophisticated crime and that the person responsible for this crime lacked sophistication." During this time, some pointed out the case coverage discrepancies. Just a month prior to Dannarriah's abduction, while sleeping in her bedroom, the nation was rocked with the brazen abduction of Elizabeth Smart from her bedroom in Utah. Elizabeth is white and came from an affluent family, and her case was covered non-stop by the media. Dannarriah came from a lower-income family and was a young black child, and despite also being abducted from her bedroom while she was sleeping, her case had far less coverage. As you probably already know, Elizabeth was rescued from her captors after enduring things that no child should have to endure. And she's used her story of survival for incredible advocacy and good. Just because Elizabeth's story was better covered does not take away from the horrible circumstances surrounding her case and the trauma she went through. But it is a great example of media bias in reporting on these cases, and so it's one of those two things can be true at the same time. This was something we needed to be better about in 2002, and it's something that we have a ways to go on in 2025. But I do think spotlighting the issue is helping to get more coverage of cases like Dannarriah's, particularly from smaller independent podcasting platforms like this one. Because of the coverage of cases like Elizabeth Smart's, Dannarriah's case was also mentioned in an article by the Austin American-Statesman titled, "Despite all the headlines, abductions by strangers are rare," which, ironically, the article went on to list 6 very recent cases of stranger abductions with a wide array of circumstances. I'm not one to say you have to live in fear, but if you listen to my podcast a lot, you know one of my soapbox things is not to erase the experiences of people who did experience that by minimizing the risks, because their family has to live with being a statistic, and most of them go on to advocate in such a way. One thing I'd be remiss in not pointing out was the police response. I am harsh on law enforcement when it's clear that they have dropped the ball. So it would be unfair if I didn't point out when they did a great job. And I have to say, I poured through all the law enforcement coverage of this case, every interview they did, all of their updates, and many of them still have pictures of her in their office. Orange Police Department has a whole Dannarriah Finley room of evidence and boxes. And from those early days of the investigation, even through now, these detectives have done amazing work. They have tried everything that current technology allowed year by year to get this case solved, always looking for forensic advancements. It's why I'm so convinced this case will be solved, but more on that in a bit. In late August of 2002, the FBI held a press conference in which Agent Ron Luthel presented evidence to the media and the public. Ron shared the sheet used to possibly transport Dannarriah's body. It was a pink, white, and yellow flower-fitted bedsheet. They were hoping the public would be able to identify who may have owned this bedsheet because it didn't come from Dannarriah's bed. It was a double-sized, flat Marvel Air model sheet produced by Springmade, and it had been discontinued for a few years. Investigators also shared that they believed the killer either resided in the 1000 block of 4th Street where Dannarriah lived, or had reason to be there that morning. So for the latter, think of someone like a mailman, for example. Within a couple of days, a police spokesperson shared they had received 10 to 12 viable new leads to pursue as a result of community contact after that press conference. It felt like momentum was building, but then it sort of waned off. Months passed, and the 1-year anniversary came and went, leaving a gaping hole in the small community. People were definitely still talking about Dannarriah, but leads were sparse. And then a headline ripped through that seemed very promising. Police pass murder case on to DA. "19 months after Dannarriah Finley's abduction and murder, Police Chief Sam Kittrell made a media announcement. He shared that the police believed they knew who did this and that they had turned all of their case over to the district attorney's office, which could take the case to a grand jury. The community was finally hopeful that there would be resolution, but it seemed to just sit there. In 2006, local media confirmed that the case was still sitting with the Orange County District Attorney's Office. While there wasn't any explicit reason for the holdup listed, Orange County Sheriff Mike White did provide some insight when he told the Orange Leader, quote, "Any case is complicated that involves a large amount of physical evidence. If it is not good quality evidence, it is harder to prove to the jury." End quote. In 2005, Hurricane Rita swept through the area and a large tree crushed the home Dannarriah once lived in. To this day, there is now just an empty lot, a haunting placeholder for the evil that occurred there in July of 2002. Each year that passed, there would be an anniversary update. And I will say that it seems like the fiber evidence in this case is a huge focus. Police Chief Sam Kittrell would often allude to it, and all they were doing to fine-tune their evidence. On the anniversary of her abduction in 2007, for example, he said, quote, "They are always developing techniques in the analysis of fibers with new microscopes and tests. The new techniques are necessary in order to provide a degree of accuracy as to the source of the fiber." The Orange Police would often go on to share that when the case was cold, it was not forgotten and not without investigation. In fact, in 2019, they conducted their most thorough review of the case since the initial investigation. In that, they identified evidence that was previously tested, but that could potentially be retested now that DNA had come so far. There was also less of a sample needed to do extensive testing than was the case in 2002. So they sent it back off, but no luck. And as of today, in 2025, Dannarriah's case remains unsolved, and her killer still eludes arrest. In 2019, when they last reported on doing large-scale retesting of evidence, genetic genealogy was way more in its infancy. The Golden State Killer had just been caught, and the trial hadn't even happened yet. So maybe there's still some hope there. Texas Ranger Brandon Best said, quote, "In Dannarriah's case, there's not necessarily untested evidence, but there might be, for lack of a better term, undertested evidence. So what they did in 2018, even up into 2019, we may have an improvement," end quote. I think anytime there's forensic evidence, there's hope. But just like so many of the other cases I discussed, police also need corroborating statements and testimony, things to help back up physical evidence. Police believe it's possible that the killer has shared what he has done with somebody else. Texas Ranger Brandon Best said, quote, "I think the most important part of this case is that we'll solve this case with the right witnesses coming forward. Everyone agrees that the folks that were involved in this absolutely talked to somebody else. They did not keep this a total secret," end quote. A person who did this crime clearly is a violent person and has the capacity to be violent. How often have you heard where a spouse of someone who would later be found to be a killer would say, Yeah, actually in an argument, he told me I'd end up just like so-and-so. So maybe somebody close to you used a threat with Dannarriah Finley attached to it, but you didn't take it seriously because you thought they were bluffing. Maybe this person has acted sexually inappropriate. I know this is a really sensitive topic, but if you were sexually abused by someone in close proximity to Dannarriah, say someone who lived in her neighborhood or was a distant relative back then, maybe you've kept this a secret. It's not uncommon for sexual abuse victims, especially children, to not come forward, but maybe you've been carrying this secret for years. That could be relevant to this case. It's hard to believe that somebody could take a 4-year-old from her bedroom and sexually assault and murder her over 20 years ago and never do anything like it again. I personally believe it's very probable that he has other sexual abuse victims, and that could be a very big key to this case. Before we wrap up, I do want to make sure I clearly note that Dannarriah's mother and aunt were cleared of any connection to the case, and Dannarriah's father and stepfather were as well. From everything I've read, they seem like wonderful people, and the police have said that a man is responsible for this case and that he committed a sexual assault and left behind DNA. This July will mark 23 years since Dannarriah's brazen abduction and murder. Taken from her bedroom while she slept in her purple flowery pajamas, a place where Dannarriah should have been safe. Dannarriah would be in her late 20s now, but she never made it to her 5th birthday. Not only was the community robbed of getting to know the amazing person Dannarriah was becoming, they were robbed of the peace of mind that their children were safe in their homes. The Mount Zion Church has continued to be a pillar in the community and leads the citizen effort in finding Dannarriah's killer and bringing justice. The church has a community center in the works geared towards youth and will be named the Dannarriah Finley Life Center. In an anniversary interview, the church's pastor spoke of how he is still impacted by the case. Pastor Crawford said, quote, "Even in my congregation, I'm somewhat nervous when I see little children coming downstairs by themselves to use the restroom. I've never forgotten what happened to Dannarriah Finley." There is a $6,000 reward for information in Dannarriah Finley's case. If you have any information, no matter how small, please reach out to the Orange Police Department at 409-883-1026. Or if you wish to remain anonymous, please contact the Texas Crime Stoppers at 1-800-252-8477. Or you can submit a tip online. Thank you for joining me for another weekly episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. I'll be back next Monday with a brand new episode. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts and share the podcast with a friend. Case suggestions can be sent to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com, and I love interacting with listeners and family. You can also find me on most social media platforms. And as always, thank you so much for listening.